Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have you sharing your time with us. Again, welcome everyone to the University of Washington School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training, or SMART Center's 2022 Virtual Speaker Series. I'm Kathy. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the SMART Center. And we have a team of people who are working to make this talk a wonderful experience for us all. We have some tech support and folks who will be posting links and resources in the chat, so please keep an eye out for those. We will be recording today, and everyone will be on mute with their videos off, and the recording for this talk will be available in a couple of weeks. On the current slide, you will see the wonderful speaker lineup for this series. Today, we're welcoming Dr. Tish Jennings, and we encourage folks to sign up for our last talk. And I want to note that this speaker series is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences, as well as the School Mental Health Supplement of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. So before moving on, we have a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington SMART Center and Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center acknowledge that we learn, live, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We are grateful to aim to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. And we encourage you all to learn more about the ancestral lands that you're joining us from. Just a little more information about the SMART Center. We're duly housed in the College of Education and the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences within the School of Medicine. Our mission is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all students in both general and special education settings. We carry out this mission through our research, training, technical assistance, and by providing support to policymaking. You can visit our website to learn more about our research and training projects, recent publications, our wonderful faculty, staff, and affiliates, one of our many events, and much more. It has been a while since all of us at the SMART Center have been together in person, but that has not dampened our enthusiasm for a good social gathering. Here you can see many of us enjoying our last virtual holiday get-together, and I sincerely hope this photo brings as big a smile to you as it does to me. So the way we think about our work here at the SMART Center is to focus on and address two primary gaps. The first is access and utilization of services, and the second is the quality of those services. These gaps are historical and inequitable, and they're also interdependent and complementary. What I mean by that is that the most accessible service won't be beneficial if it's not high quality, and the highest quality service won't be beneficial if it's not broadly accessible. So that is where we focus our work. Going one step further, here you can see more about our role in setting the context through research, generating evidence by development and testing models that work, mobilizing that evidence through training and technical assistance, as well as learning more about implementation and technical assistance strategies, and finally through building political will by dissemination of information and being part of the conversations with funders and policymakers, as we do, for example, through our University of Washington SMART Center Policy Core. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our UW SMART Center postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Hugh, Dr. McVeigh, Dr. Zuloff-McCurdy, and me. Part of the reason we are bringing you this series now for the 4th year in a row is through a grant from the Institute of Education Sciences, which allows us to bring in these incredible postdocs. And as a SMART Center postdoc, I cannot rave enough about the 3 brilliant women pictured alongside me. As I mentioned previously, the speaker series is also sponsored by our Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center's School Mental Health Project, which is part of a national network of mental health technology transfer centers. We know some of you may be joining us from outside of our Region 10 and want to make sure you know which center to connect with in your area. I also want to bring your attention to two population-focused centers, the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. You can visit the mhttcnetwork.org website to connect with another center or learn about center-wide activities. This is our regional center, and we support the school mental health workforce in Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We welcome you to connect with us on our website, our newsletter, listserv, or social media. And just a brief disclaimer before we get to introducing the guest of honor. SAMHSA sponsors this work, but that does not reflect any official position on this content. And now I would like to ask Dr. Jennings to join us. Dr. Patricia or Tish Jennings is an internationally recognized leader in the fields of social and emotional learning and mindfulness in education, and is a professor of education at the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. Her research places a specific emphasis on teacher stress and how it impacts the social and emotional context of the classroom, as articulated in her highly cited theoretical article, The Pro-Social Classroom, which is an article I might have cited once or many times. Dr. Jennings led the team that developed CARE, a mindfulness-based professional development program shown to significantly improve teacher well-being, classroom interactions, and student engagement in the largest randomized controlled trial of a mindfulness-based intervention designed specifically to address teacher occupational stress. She is a co-author of Flourish, the Compassionate Schools Project curriculum, which is an integrated health and physical education program, and she is co-investigator on a large randomized controlled trial to evaluate the curriculum's efficacy. She is currently the principal investigator of Project Catalyze, a study that will examine whether the CARE intervention enhances the effectiveness of a social and emotional learning curriculum funded by an Education Innovation Research Grant from the U.S. Department of Education. A member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Fostering Healthy Mental, Emotional, and Behavioral Development Among Children and Youth, she was awarded the Kathy Kerr Award for Courageous and Compassionate Science by the Mind and Life Institute in 2018. And was recently recognized by Mindfulness Magazine as one of 10 mindfulness researchers you should know, and I could not agree more. Earlier in her career, Dr. Jennings spent more than 22 years as a teacher, school director, and teacher educator. She is the author of numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, chapters, and several books, including Mindfulness for Teachers, Simple Skills for Peace and Productivity in the Classroom, The Trauma-Sensitive School, Building Resilience with Compassionate Teaching, and her most recent book, Teacher Burnout Turnaround Strategies for Empowered Teachers, which was released in December of 2020. As someone who has had the absolute pleasure of learning from Dr. Jennings, I am delighted and just over the moon to have her sharing her time, expertise, and wisdom with us today. And with that, I will hand things off to her.
Thank you, Kathy. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today. And to address this really important issue that I'm focusing on. Oh, my title isn't showing up for some reason. Anyway, it was on the other slide. I'm hoping that the slides look okay. Let me just check here. Okay, good. All right, well, I can start here. So today, I'm focusing on how can we support our educator workforce right now. It's a really tough time to be a teacher. And a lot of the problems in education today are exacerbating the stress. And COVID just sort of tipped the scales into a place where teachers are really struggling right now. I'm going to talk about how we can give ourselves space as educators in this context. I'm going to talk about how mindfulness can help us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our biological survival systems and how mindfulness can help us. I talk about hacking these systems in a way that can promote well-being, especially in an educational context. I'm going to talk about stress, emotions in the brain, and why this is really important to creating learning environments that are successful. And I'll touch on empathy-based stress and talk about compassion. And then we'll have time for Q&A to address any questions that come up for you all. So if you've been a teacher or worked in classrooms, you know that sometimes it can feel like this. I like this cartoon because it portrays a kind of perception that as a teacher, I would sometimes feel when my classroom, my stress level was so high that the perception that I had was that it was chaos. Later on, I realized that this is something that happens when we're feeling stressed. We misperceive what's going on around us. And sometimes it feels like our classroom is like this because there are incredibly demanding social and cognitive processes that are going on in this context, especially under the conditions that most of us have been working for the last 150 years, because our school systems haven't brought our systems into the 21st century. So there are certain aspects of it that add stress to the existing demands that are already challenging. One of the things that's important to understand is that this stress response that we have, that's part of our biological inheritance, it evolved to help us deal with lions or things like lions, like real physical threats to our survival. But today, often we feel threatened and our stress response is triggered because of psychological threat or perceived threat or threat to our sense of self or threat to our professional identity, whatever it is, that triggers the same stress response that occurs when we are physically threatened. But it can interfere with things. In the classroom, it can interfere with our functioning, because when we do feel threatened and we feel exhausted by these demands and our resources are impaired, we tend to overreact to situations. So for example, if I know the bell is going to ring in 5 minutes and I'm trying to get through this lesson because next week my students are going to be taking tests that are going to reflect on me, and one of my students is, I don't know, falling on the floor, giggling, instead of seeing that through a lens of like, this is kind of normal child behavior and isn't this maybe funny? Instead, I see that as a personal threat because I have this time frame that I'm dealing with. And I'm trying to get through this lesson. And so it triggers my stress response. I feel threatened and I may overreact. I may perceive that behavior as something intentional, like he's trying to drive me crazy. I may over exaggerate the importance of it and the intentionality of it as well. That's a normal tendency human beings have. When we feel emotionally exhausted and we become overreactive, like I just described, it adds to the classroom disruption because the student doesn't understand my perspective and may actually feel like I'm attacking them. And so then they get defensive and reactive. And then we have a cycle that adds more demands to the classroom already. So we get this negative self-reinforcing cycle. This is something that we talk about in the Pro-Social Classroom article that Kathy was referring to. And I saw in the chat box, people would like a copy, and I'm happy to share that. So in order to get past this tendency that we all have, is we have to give ourselves space. We have to give ourselves some grace and space. And I love this quote it's attributed to Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So giving ourselves that space, take a moment, take a breath and go, wait a minute, what's really happening here? You know, what's going on inside of me? Am I feeling tense? maybe I can calm myself down. Maybe when I do that, I can perceive what's going on outside me in a different way. And I might see that how to respond to the situation rather than reacting automatically. So also, I think it's really important to accept how things are right now. They are really difficult. COVID has, in a way, accelerated a process of change that was already occurring in our society. It was already the case that it's very hard to predict what our world is going to be like 5 years, 10 years from now. And so we're living with a kind of uncertainty that is in many ways new to us. And it's scary. It's scary for everybody. And it's a huge stressor, especially for schools right now that were already kind of archaic. And now that is becoming really obvious. And we need to make some changes. And also the other thing that's become very obvious is that there are huge disparities in access to resources. And I'm really excited to hear that the Smart Center is really focused on this. It's become so important and clear that we have huge disparities in access to resources. And then on top of this, we have this huge mental health crisis going on right now. 6 in 10 say they're experiencing these strong negative emotions, and even clinical levels of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and hopelessness. And I don't know about where you all are, but around here, it's very, very difficult to find an appointment with a mental health worker right now because everybody is in crisis. So how do we do this? How do we accept how things are right now? One way is to cultivate and practice mindfulness. So the way I like to refer to mindfulness is it's a state of mind. It can also be considered a personal trait because some people are naturally more mindful than others. But it's also a practice that you can use to generate and cultivate your own capacity to bring mindfulness into your everyday life. It involves bringing your attention to the present moment, but it's also cultivating an attitude. So while you're bringing your attention to this present moment, and that may involve noticing thoughts, it might be noticing sensations, physical sensations, maybe associated with an emotional experience, so that when I'm feeling stress, I might be more aware of it. One of the things we realize in the school context we were talking about earlier is that our attention when we're teaching is so outwardly directed because we're trying to keep tabs on so much going on simultaneously that often we don't notice what's going on inside of us. And sometimes our stress can take us by surprise because it can build until the point where we lose control because we didn't even realize that our stress level was rising like that. So mindfulness can make us more aware of, oh, I'm noticing my shoulders are getting tense. I'm noticing my jaw is getting tense. I'm feeling hot. Those are all signals that my stress response is elevating, and I can be proactive and focus attention on breath, noticing my body in space, and all that can help me manage that stress response in a way that will allow me to make choices and decisions with that space that I've created for myself. And so this acceptance of the present moment with some curiosity and acceptance. So the present moment may be very uncomfortable, actually, and just being okay with that and being present for it, not trying to change it, not trying to suppress it, just being with it allows it to become less salient and allows us to move past it. So it allows us to be present for difficult feelings in the present moment. So I'd like to invite you to take a brief mindfulness practice with me right now. One of the very basic ways to practice mindfulness is to focus attention on the sensation of the breath. And as you do this, you notice there are lots of ways to do this. You know, we think about breathing as something really simple, but it's not. it involves the air, feeling the air going through your nostril, going down your windpipe into your lungs, feeling all that happening on the inside of the body. You can feel your diaphragm rising and falling on the inside of your body and noticing that. You can also feel your chest and your abdomen rising and falling as you do that. So at first we think, oh, we're just thinking about our breathing, but it's not. It's really focusing on the sensation. And so one way to get prepared for that is just take a moment and touch your hand like I'm doing, and just focus attention on what it feels like to touch your hand. Not thinking about it, just feeling it. Really feel what that feels like. When we bring attention in the present moment to our body, to our breath, to whatever it is, we bring ourselves out of our head and into our body. We bring ourselves into the present. And the breath is a great way to do it because we have access to that anytime we need to. We don't need any special equipment. We don't need any special training. It's pretty simple. So one way to start this practice is to close your eyes if that's what you'd like to do. You don't have to. You can just lower your gaze. And it also helps to sit up tall, because as you're breathing, you want your lungs to have all the capacity to open and close as much as possible. And for this practice, we're going to just take 3 slow, mindful breaths at our own pace. So I'm not going to guide you through that. You're going to take your time. I will guide you through the practice, but not the numbers of breaths. Once you're done with your 3 slow, long, deep breaths, just allow your breath to settle into its natural rhythm. So sitting up nice and tall, closing your eyes. Before we start the 3 deep breaths, just take a moment to notice your body sitting wherever you are on a chair. You might notice the weight of your body here in this present moment. And then start by letting all the air out. Just blow all your air out of your body. And take a long, slow, deep breath, noticing what it feels like. Feeling the air fill your body. And then letting it out. And do this 2 more times at your own pace. Really focusing your attention on the sensation of that air going in and out. And then allowing your breath to settle into its natural rhythm. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And take a moment to reflect on that experience. How was that for you? Just think about that. Were you able to focus your attention on your breath, those 3 breaths? Did you notice yourself becoming distracted, which might have happened because that's normal? That's what the mind does. It goes off and starts thinking about the past or the present or the future or something like, oh, when are we going to have a break? Or what am I going to do later? Those are normal things that will happen. And the practice is to bring the attention back to that sensation of the breath. And so the other thing that might happen is your experience of that focused attention might change over the course of that practice. This is a very brief practice, but it's a good introduction. And the other thing we've learned in our research is just taking 3 breaths like that can give us that space. It can help us shift. It can reduce the autonomic reactivity, nervous system reactivity, and it can prepare us to do something, to make a response that's intentional rather than a reaction. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our research at the end here, but this particular practice has been, our teachers that we've worked with have told us it's the #1 go-to for them. You don't have to close your eyes. You can even make it just one deep breath, but the ability to recognize, I need to take a breath, I need to breathe, helps us make that shift. And it helps us build resilience, this ability to flourish, even in the midst of all this difficulty and ambiguity and all this rapid change. It allows us to creatively respond, because when we're in that reactive mode, we rely on habits and reactive patterns that may be adaptive if a lion is chasing us, but they're not so adaptive if we're dealing with a really complex interpersonal dynamic that we have to really calm down and process and interact in a way that isn't going to trigger other people's reactivity. So that's why I call mindfulness in a way a biohack, because we have this biological inheritance that got us here. I mean, we have to be grateful for it, but today often it gets in our way, and we need these tools to hack it so that we can be more intentional in the way we act instead of automatically reacting in ways that cause us problems. It allows us to be more aware of the fact that things are changing all the time, whether we like it or not. We evolved under conditions that were pretty stable, and things didn't change that much very frequently. We lived in small communities that didn't move very far through our whole life. And now from one day to the next is unpredictable. So the threat response or the stress response is part of a bigger context of survival systems that are biological in nature. The threat response, fight, flight, freeze response, it is core to our ability to survive. But our affiliation system is also really important to our survival, and we often overlook it. This comes from our attachment system. This is our connection with our community, our family, our friends, the people we work with. For human beings, this survival system is really, really, really important. And the third one is the drive system, which is associated with competition or achievement. So in our systems, and actually in our society right now, the threat system is accentuated a lot. We use the threat system to try to push people into the drive system. We use a carrot stick thing to try to get people to do what we want them to do. If they're not doing what we want them to do, they get punished. That's kind of our culture right now. And we don't pay very much attention to the affiliation system at all. And so I argue that in our educational systems today, we need to reduce the threat and increase the affiliation. We need to build a sense of community and stop using punitive and coercive methods to try to get kids and teachers to do what we want them to do. Building community will help us be more successful at this. We know that today because the prefrontal cortex is really important to learning and teaching because it regulates our ability to attend to things. It helps us focus our attention and modulate our attention. It's involved in our executive functioning, our ability to plan, working memory, which is so key to learning, our executive functions, oh, I said that, and our social skills, our ability to understand somebody else's perspective and make good social decision making. And we now know that too much stress can impair the development of self-regulation, which will interfere with learning. And over time can cause learning difficulties and behavior problems, especially for kids who are exposed to risk factors like trauma. And social support can be very protective. It can help kids. So this affiliation system can help us recover from the results of the threat system. It can help balance us back to equilibrium. But now we also know that teacher stress can affect students in a negative way because this stress is contagious and we pick it up in our environment. We also know a lot more about emotions nowadays, and emotions are definitely associated with these biological functions. So negative emotions, I put negative in quotes because I don't like to give the impression that these emotions that we typically call negative are bad. They're not bad at all, like anger, fear. They have a function, but sometimes they're unpleasant and uncomfortable. And they're involved in the stress response. So when we talk about fear and anger, we're talking about the flight and the fight response and the stress response. They narrow our focus, literally. There's research that shows that when we're feeling stress or threat, we're not seeing the whole picture because it helps us survive if we can focus on the threat. It also reinforces negative perceptions that we're thinking about, because if our stress level needs to be elevated to protect ourselves, then having rumination that's reinforcing those feelings will help keep it elevated and help us survive. So that's why when the student is interfering with my lesson, the thoughts that might occur are, he's driving me crazy. He's driving me crazy. It's all his fault. He does this all the time. Those are the kinds of thoughts that reinforce that feeling of threat. They also are involved in our limited conditioned reactivity, the habits of mind and body that we grew up with, that we don't think, we just react. And they're associated with those. In contrast, positive or pleasant or comfortable emotions are deeply involved in the affiliation system, feelings of love, happiness, gratitude. And in fact, when we feel these feelings together in community, it's incredibly powerful in terms of helping us feel connected to one another. They also undo the negative effects of negative emotions, and they build these resources. They also broaden our focus. They allow us to see the whole context and understand what's going on with other people. Allows us to see, maybe he didn't sleep last night and that's why he's laying on the floor, instead of he's trying to drive me crazy. So it gives us more opportunity to be creative in our responding. It's also important to recognize that as human beings, we have something called a negativity bias that can get in the way. And you can see why we do, because it also can accentuate our survival. If we're always anticipating the negative, we're more likely to survive. But that means that at the end of the day, what I remember is the one time the kid was rolling on the floor, instead of the many, many moments where my students and I were engaged in wonderful learning experiences. So we just have to remember that about us. And to do this, we can intentionally cultivate and savor positive emotions together. We can when we're having those moments in the classroom, we can point them out. We can say, wow, isn't this fun? Look what we're doing. We're all happy. Doesn't it feel good to be happy doing this together? Especially with kids who are coming from difficult contexts where maybe they're not noticing those things very often, and they need some help noticing when they're feeling these positive emotions and what do those feel like? Really investigating them. They will help build resilience as well. But we also have to be careful of something that's nowadays called toxic positivity. And I've been as I think back in my years as a teacher, I did this a lot. Like, oh, it's okay. It's okay. You'll be all right. It's dismissing how people are actually feeling and pushing away difficult feelings. We need to be able to accept when people are feeling how they're feeling and be present for them instead of trying to push it away. And that can also involve applying mindfulness to how we listen to others. Because if you're like me, when I'm listening, I'm often thinking about what I'm going to say instead of actually really being present for what the person's telling me. And if you're suffering, having someone just listen to you can make a huge difference. And we can also intentionally practice compassion for ourselves and for others. And this can play a really important role in something that's called empathetic distress. This is the experience of adverse psychological or physical reactions to trauma exposure at work. So if I'm a teacher who is exposed to a student who is living through some awful trauma, or I have a trauma history myself, being exposed to that trauma can generate feelings of distress. Because empathy, we now know, can also feel distressing. My friend and colleague, Tanya Singer, who's a professor at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, did this amazing research looking at the difference between empathy and compassion. And empathy can lead to empathetic distress, because when we're feeling empathy, sometimes we're feeling those same feelings that the person who's suffering near us is feeling. That's what we do as human beings. But that can also be extremely exhausting. It can result in poor health, and it can also result in withdrawal. Whereas compassion is a really different experience. It's a feeling of generating love or care or compassion or caring for another person. And it involves the wish to help, the desire to help, to do something to help. And this feeling actually shows up differently in the brain. This is what she discovered, because empathy is linked to parts of the brain that are associated with pain, whereas compassion is associated with the reward center of the brain, because it's a rewarding feeling. So it can help us avoid empathetic distress and be prepared to help others when they need it. We can do this by intentionally kindling what I call kindling a warm heart. And there's different practices in the contemplative space, like loving kindness practice, that intentionally generates this feeling by thinking about somebody that you care about deeply, and generating that feeling and then extending that feeling to other people who maybe aren't in your in community or in group, like your family, extending it out, practicing extending it out to people who you don't really have any strong feelings about one way or the other. Can you extend that same feeling and then extend it out to maybe even someone who's a little troublesome or difficult? But the whole idea is, can we generate this feeling of warm-heartedness as a regular feeling state that we can intentionally cultivate? And it can build a lot of internal resources and resilience when we do this as a regular practice. If you are interested in doing more of this, just Google loving kindness practice. And Sharon Salzberg is a person who is an expert in this, and she's has many practices out there. If you just Google it, I highly recommend it. Finally, I just want to briefly touch on the research that I've been conducting for the last few years on this program we call CARE. CARE stands for Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education. And it's a pretty intensive program, and it's the study that we conducted in New York City that we reported on in these articles that I'm citing here was a 4-day training, 2 full days at the beginning of the school year, and then 2 separate days spread out in the first part of the school year, and then a booster in the spring. And the program combines, it teaches mindful awareness practices, a variety of them, with the intention of building this emotional awareness that I was describing, so that teachers are able to make the shift that I was talking about. And we do this through learning these practices, understanding emotions, but also role plays and discussions around particular experiences teachers have and how they might replay them. So we do role playing around these kinds of challenging situations that are common in classroom contexts to help them get used to the feeling of like, how would I do that? And so we enact them in ways that allow them to go, oh, now I understand where that student was coming from. That's the thing. One of the things I notice about these activities that we teach in this training is it gives teachers insight into the students' perspectives that they may have completely overlooked in the midst of some of these situations because they were reactive. So we were interested in, does this program reduce teacher stress? Does it improve their mindfulness? And does it improve their emotion regulation? And does it have an impact on their classroom environments? Does it change the way teachers are behaving in the classroom? And then does it improve student outcomes? So the program does not teach teachers anything to do differently with students. It's really about their own internal processes. So this student outcomes is a pretty distal outcome in this study. But we did find that for one, the teachers' psychological distress was reduced. Something called time urgency, which I described at the beginning because you've got to get through your lesson. That was reduced. We heard in our qualitative research that teachers would say, you know, I was realizing I was so worried about not having enough time that I wasn't doing what I needed to do, that time urgency was sort of paralyzing them. So helping overcome that. We saw improvements in emotion regulation and mindfulness in the teacher self-reports. We observed the classrooms using the class measure of classroom interactions that was developed by our dean at the University of Virginia, Bob Pianta. So we observed these interactions and we found that the interactions were more emotionally positive. The teachers were more sensitive to the needs of their students. And the classrooms were more emotionally positive just generally. We also showed improvements in productivity in that part of the class. Then in student outcomes, we found a direct impact on teacher-reported engagement across the board. But the moderating effects, I think, are even more interesting because students who were low on social skills at baseline showed improvements in reading competence and motivation. And then when we looked at contextual risk, and we identified this, we called teacher mindfulness or lack of mindfulness or mindlessness as a contextual risk. Those students improved more as well. Teachers who were low on mindfulness improved in motivation and also I think there were a couple other academic outcomes that I'm now forgetting at the moment, but we did show improvements in those cases as well. So this was kind of the first time, it was in a way a proof of concept that if you do this with teachers, it can have downstream effects in the classroom and students that are very positive. So my timing has been great. I have plenty of time for questions. Before we go to the questions though, I just want to point out these books that Kathy mentioned earlier in case you're interested in learning more about this, because I cover, oh, one of the books isn't showing up. Mindfulness for Teachers is the one that's not showing up. I talk a lot about this in that book, but I also apply some of this to trauma sensitive work and what we can do in the classroom with mindfulness as well, and how to help teachers manage burnout. So I'm going to go back to my Q&A slide, but I think I will stop sharing so that I can see Kathy again and answer any questions that might have come up. Oh, thank you for putting that in the chat, my Jennings and Greenberg. Thank you.
That's you're welcome. Yeah, thank you so much for that talk, Tish. People were sharing in the chat, asking for the slides, just lots of gratitude in there. We had a few questions come in before the talk, so I'll ask you those, but I do encourage participants here today to use the Q&A. If you have questions for Dr. Jennings, we'd be happy to spend this time asking her about those. So the first question, which I think is really relevant and on everyone's minds these days, is really about how to integrate or approach some of these practices you discussed with teachers and students with an equity lens in mind. Is there anything that teachers or school staff should consider or be aware of? And we could extend that to culturally relevant practices, which I know you mentioned.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that comes to my mind is, and I just give you a little history. When these practices started being used in education, they were often brought into schools from people who come from sort of Buddhist traditions, and mostly white, mostly upper middle class people, or yoga, both of those two places. And so often they would come into schools without any understanding of the context or learning and education, understanding of that. And so there were a lot of mistakes that have been made in the past about how we bring this into a school. And in some ways that they weren't completely secular. There was a case where yoga was brought into a school in California, and they were using terminology that comes from the Hindu tradition. And that was not okay for parents. The parents were very upset about that. Now, you can do yoga without talking about Sanskrit words, or mudras or whatever comes from that religious background. Some of the practices you can do in yoga involve noticing where your body is in space, and learning to become more agile, but you don't, the other religious part of it is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be brought in. Same goes for the Buddhist aspects of mindfulness. So that it's really important to see that these are processes. Paying attention to your breath, noticing your breath and focusing on your breath can be completely secular. And we know from a lot of research that it works well. But different people are going to want to contextualize it in their own way. And in school context, the religious part of it isn't appropriate. So over time, some of us, I've been speaking out about this from the beginning and saying, this isn't the way that is going to work in schools. So I think every context, when you bring it into a school, it has to be very thoughtful about this context. Who are these people that I'm working with? In what way do they view this kind of a practice? How does it meet their needs from their background? Because this ability to focus on the present moment can be found in all cultures. And other religious traditions too. So I just think it's important to understand that where it came from in the US and how to make it appropriate for schools.
Yeah, great, thank you. What you just shared also speaks to another question I was actually going to ask you. Someone had written in asking about how to approach teachers or school staff in communication around these mindful practices who might be very resistant to them. Those folks who you just talked about, who might hear the word mindfulness and be like, oh, that is not for me, no. And I love your suggestion to really, pay attention to the context. Who are these people, and leverage those relationships to engage in some of those conversations.
Yeah, an example of that is when I first started, and I noticed it's getting less so. There isn't as much resistance and pushback as there used to be at all, which is great. I think people are just more familiar with it, and the research has grown to the degree that people can't really argue that it can be beneficial. But for example, when I first started teaching loving kindness practice, which in our program we call caring practice, we just tried to use a terminology that wasn't so associated with this Buddhist practice. What I realized was I needed to give people alternatives for the ways to do this, because I had people say, well, I don't think it's up to me to do that extension of care, because in my religious tradition, that is something that I ask Jesus to do, And so I thought, oh, well, if that's the way it works for you, then sure, you can do it that way. You can contextualize it in the way that works for you. So that if for you as a teacher, you need to make that into an internal prayer, then that's great. In fact, in our sample in New York, we discovered we had a lot of Latinx teachers in that sample, and a lot of them reported that they were praying more as a result of our intervention. That was there was an increase in mindfulness, but there was also an increase in prayer. And so we learned that people can take mindful awareness practices and contextualize them in their own faith tradition, whatever works best for them. But you need to give them that permission, and you need to help them see that that's possible. And when they do, I've had people tell me, oh my gosh, my prayer has improved so much because I'm mindfully praying, so I think everybody can learn to find ways to fit it into their lives in ways that work for them.
I love that. And that just sounds so individually empowering, right? Like tailoring the practice to your own self and your needs. And that's just wonderful. That's a great example.
Well, I just want to add to that. I think that's another issue that I believe is a shift I'm seeing in the mindfulness research world, because there was this sort of tendency to think about, evidence-based mindfulness is mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, which Jon Kabat-Zinn developed, which is amazing, but it's not going to be the be all end all. And what was happening, especially with adolescents, is they were taking MBSR and trying to transfer it into programming for adolescents. And that is, in my mind, not necessarily appropriate, because Jon Kabat-Zinn, his original group of people he was working with were people who had chronic pain in clinical settings. And so what works for people with chronic pain in clinical settings is not necessarily transferable to adolescents. And there are many elements of MBSR that can be modified, adapted, and everybody can learn these different elements and use them to build their own self-care plan in a way that works for them. Once they start learning them, they can say, oh, I'm having this really horrible feeling about this work colleague. I need to practice caring practice, or, to help me extend my sense of care for this person so that when I talk to them later, I won't be snarky or whatever,
Absolutely. Someone else wrote in, they shared that we are seeing the need to care for teachers in an intentional way, building activities into staff meetings. And they were wondering which book or resource you would recommend this person, or anyone on right now, that folks might share with trainees, teachers, to support their role of supporting the teaching staff. And I'm actually going to extend that question, because I think that person might be a leader, and maybe there's a book suggestion for a leader. Do you have a book suggestion for teachers if they wanted to have a book club to begin engaging in some of this as well? And it could be your own or others.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's mindfulness for teachers. I wrote that book specifically for teachers to do that. I realized at some point that the CARE program was not going to be very accessible because it's so long and intensive. And so I wrote that book, and that book contains more actually than is in the CARE training. It's a book, so it doesn't have maybe have the same impact, we don't know. But if you use it as a book study and you do some of the practices together in that book, then in a sense, you're kind of doing your own CARE training in a way. So I would recommend that. I think it's also really important. I know right now self-care is kind of becoming a buzzword, and I'm hearing that teachers are being told, just go care for yourself, do some self-care, instead of really changing some of the things in the system that are causing stress. So I think it's really important to understand that the mindfulness is really good for this interaction level, classroom level kind of stressors that are going on. It can really help with that. But it's not going to help with some of the systemic problems that are happening unless it's used to look at that system and bring insight into that system to make changes. So I just want to point that out, because I'm not saying that mindfulness is going to be a panacea for all these stressors at all.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. And it's such an important point, because I've heard that as well from educators and critics, right? That this mindfulness revolution in schools is not going to solve everything. And I love your point that it's a both and, right? Like it can help with these interaction level, just with your daily interactions with school staff, with students, but also that systemic change is needed and will all be better when both of those things happen.
Well, one thing I say in my most recent book is that when we're aware of these systems and how and in what way they are stressing us, causing stress, we're more able to express the problem and talk about what potential solutions might be. And right now, teachers have more leverage than they've had ever, because there's such a big shortage and a growing shortage. And so if I'm in a classroom right now and I see that there's something going on in my system that's making my job really difficult, I might be better positioned to go to the school leader and say, hey, we need to change this because it's, adding to my stress level. And I don't think we need to do it this way. How about if we have a meeting and make some plans about shifting this? Like one example would be time. The way time is measured and allocated in education is incredibly arbitrary in many ways, you know? So that's something that could be open to a shift that might make their lives a lot easier.
Yeah, great point. So someone else wrote in, and this is,
it's a long, it's long.
It is, and I'm actually going to read it for the participants, because I think it's a good collaborative learning moment. This person is seeking for understanding and love a good collaborative learning moment. So this person says, you stated that when we are in a reactive mode, we move into limited conditional reactivity and fall into pre-established patterns in our reactions to stressors. That resonates on a physiological level. And I've also felt experience it happen in a cognitive space in the form of conditioned narratives. So when stressors go up, people seem to fall into the same stories about themselves and others. One of the benefits of mindfulness might be to become aware of the story. So again, the narrative of the stressors. So this is, I think, the collaborative learning moment. So conceived of this way, can we say that mindfulness might facilitate more trauma-informed responses by keeping us from judgmental, limited, and harmful meaning making? And then they ask for your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. This is that. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, especially when our students come to us from a trauma history, they have patterns and habits that they have learned in their context that have helped them survive. And like a couple of them that are very obvious, one of them is hyperreactivity and hypervigilance. If you're living in a dangerous context, your hypervigilance is actually very adaptive, because you're keeping an eye out for when danger might be directed at you. In a classroom context, that may seem really maladaptive, because you may have a hard time focusing your attention because you don't feel safe. And so students like that might need some extra help. First of all, feeling safe and realizing that they're in a place where they don't have to be hypervigilant, but this isn't something you can explain. It's something that they have to feel. And for an adult in that context, if they don't understand that that might be occurring, they may end up using some kind of punitive reaction, which will just reinforce that trauma and reinforce that feeling of danger and threat and hyperreactivity. So you're just, making things difficult. The other tendency, I know this one really well because I have my own trauma history. And what I did as a kid was dissociate, which means you just sort of check out. And when that happens, you can also run into problems. For what happened to me was teachers would call me stupid because I wouldn't respond to questions, or they would ask me a question and I wouldn't have been present for that question. So I wouldn't know what they were asking. And so I did appear like I wasn't engaged and I didn't care. And I was, and so those are just two examples of where our minds automatically go, oh, they're not paying attention. Oh, they have ADHD. Oh, they're distractible. And with that awareness, we can shift the way we respond to them. But yeah, it's really, really good point.
Yeah. I thank you for sharing that. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to also say, well, my colleagues and I are really interested in exploring how this might also support implicit bias or awareness of implicit bias or overcoming implicit bias. Because the other thing that happens is that we can automatically react to situations where something's going on that involves a person of a different color that we don't even realize that we're doing it. We might overreact because the kid happens to be African-American. And that's because we have this implicit bias. And when we're stressed, we just react that way. I wouldn't say a teacher might necessarily want to do that and not even be aware they're doing it. So we want to do some research to see, do these practices help teachers see when that's happening so that they don't over-discipline kids of color?
That's so interesting. So the big idea being that if you provide teachers with these practices to help manage their own stress that provides them with the personal resources to make more intentional decisions in their interactions with students.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Amazing. So I have a question about, we have a lot of educators on today, and I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how some of what you talked about today, and particularly the implementation of some of these practices, might need to be tailored differently for example, general versus special education spaces or early education. I know we have a lot of preschool teachers on today versus like K-12. And I'm particularly thinking about in the K-12 space, secondary schools, where very different from elementary schools, right? These secondary teachers interact with so many more students in a day. Just more opportunities for stress, less opportunity for these meaningful connections just due to less time with folks. So just, any thoughts about that?
Well, most of my own personal experience is with younger children. And in those contexts, I feel like the adults' own mindfulness in a way models a kind of mindfulness for younger children. The more I am mindful in an environment with young students, the more they are attending to me. And the more, it's almost like, this word may not exactly be appropriate, but it feels like in a kind of an entrainment. It's kind of like the same way emotions can be contagious. I think in some contexts, the adult's mindfulness can be kind of contagious. Because what I noticed when I was teaching, I've been practicing mindfulness for a really long time. And so I was practicing mindfulness before I became a teacher. And I did some of these practices in my own classroom a lot years ago. And I found that when I was practicing with my students, but I was really present for them, I wasn't, I was really practicing, I guess I would say. It was much more likely to see them engage too. Now, there were times, I'm talking about preschoolers, when they were not, but I didn't try to force it on them. I would just say, I did something we call planned ignoring. If they weren't attending, that's fine. The ones that were attending, I engaged with them. And they're very brief. You can only do this for, a minute maybe with little kids. But over time, they got more and more capable. And the other thing with younger kids, I always use something sensory to help them focus their attention, like a chime. Or if you do want to, well, I can even share something with young kids. We sometimes use this Hoberman sphere to give them a model of what breathing might be like. So, and what's really fun using something like this too, is it gives them something to focus their visual attention on, because it's hard to get little kids to close their eyes. But, you can inhale and exhale with this, and they can take turns leading the class too. This is a big one. They make smaller ones for kids. So with young kids, keeping it short, keeping it sensory, being present yourself and modeling it. And my book, Mindfulness in the Pre-K 5 Classroom, I talk about a lot of things like this. With older kids, first of all, I think they need to have an understanding of why they should even be interested in this, and I think my friend Trish Broderick developed a program called Learning to Breathe, which she has studied and has been found to be very effective in helping students. She contextualizes it in terms of giving kids an edge. So like if they're into sports and they want to be better at sports, developing this capacity to focus your attention mindfully can help you in sports. So she tried to give them some reason why this might be helpful. And the practices, again, they need to be brief. I mean, they can't do, half-hour practice like adults can do. And they need to, the other thing that with adolescents, I think you have to be careful about is the metacognitive processes that are involved in the mindfulness adults do might tend to reinforce rumination in adolescence if you're not careful. I think that's another reason I think it's important to keep attention focused on something something sensory, because the more sensory it is, the less cognitive it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really important point. I can totally see how that would happen among adolescents, having been one, but also having worked with them.
But I want to say one thing. We really don't know very much about this. This is all me speculating from my own experience anecdotally. We really need to understand better the developmental processes that we're talking about here, because we know a lot about what's going on with adults. We know about the neuroscience. We know all of this. But with children and their developmental process, we don't really know very much. I just want to make sure that everybody realizes that.
Yeah, really important point. Thank you for highlighting that. The other thing I was just very quickly before I get to our last question that I was going to say, I love the idea of sort of, for lack of a better term, selling it to students, maybe not based on the thing you care about for them, right? Like it'll help you do better in class, but something they care about, because not only may it actually, result in some buy-in on their part, but I can only imagine that strengthens the teacher-student relationship, right? Because it shows that you've been paying enough attention to know what might be important to them, so on and so forth. So I really loved that example. So this last question we have, so this person said, in thinking about accessibility, we observe that our school staff own the narrative that we already have too much to do. Why are you giving me more to incorporate into my classroom? I think a lot of people can relate to this, especially in the past couple of years. So how can we encourage staff buy-in in the culture of scarcity and overwhelm? So I think this person is asking, how do you make this, mindful practices seem like not just one more thing they're being asked to do?
That's a really good question. I think I'm going to frame this in sort of the larger context, because this is part of the structural problems in education that they're talking about. There's not enough time. There's too many demands. And in mindfulness is not going to solve that. And if you try to go to a group of teachers who are feeling all these pressures and you tell them, well, they may push back. I mean, I can see why they would. So maybe there's a way to frame this in terms of how can we, not only can we build our own resilience, our own personal capacity, but how can we change our system so that so that both of these, so it's not an either or. So it's really, so I would say, let's, as school leaders, start empowering our teachers to express what they need and respond to that, on top of giving them these other tools. Because if we only try to give them these tools, they're going to feel like, in some ways, we're trying to placate them, rather than actually addressing the real problems with the system that need to change. And these changes I'm seeing are occurring in small ways in schools, but they start from the ground up, but they will only happen when we listen to what the teachers are telling us they need, because they are the ones that are spending day after day after day with their students, and they can see, okay, why do we have to do it like this? So I think giving teachers more voice and choice on top of providing these kind of supports could be very, very beneficial. I haven't tested that theory, but I would like to see that happen.
I mean, voice and choice is very popular, when serving youth in school. So I can imagine it might be very effective for the adults supporting those youth. Well, that wraps up our Q&A section. Just thank you so much, Tish. This was wonderful. People were really excited about some of the resources you shared. We shared some links in real time. And if you could share those last couple of slides. We do hope that you'll join us again for our next presentation on May 25th by Drs. Walter Gilliam and Tunette Powell. You can find the registration link on our website. It'll be a great talk, and it's the final talk of this speaker series. And we hope that you all have a great day. Thank you for joining us.